Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Complexity Lounge, a meetup where we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems. I'm Jocko Selberg, and somewhere out there sipping margaritas is the multifaceted, uber-talented Barbara Frontera, and together we co-host the lounge. Before we kick it off today, just a few quick ground rules. We will be recording today's session, so if you do not wish to be recorded, please make sure your camera and microphone are turned off. We also ask that you keep the side chat to a minimum. We want to kind of open this up for conversation. And after Viv and Julie's short introduction, we'll have a question and answer period, or we'll open up for conversation with y'all. You could either raise your hand or just send questions directly to Barbara. I leave it up to you. If you do send them to Barbara, just put a big Q in front of them so that she knows it's a question and not necessarily a comment. And also the recording will be posted on Vimeo on our Complexity Lounge page in the next couple of days, and that's where you'll find all of our past videos from the lounge. So today, our guests today are Viv Reed and Julie Cunningham, both hailing from complexibility.com.au. They are both leading lights in the sense-making community, embracing and utilizing complex methods, including, but not limited to, narrative research and complex facilitation. And they've been doing this sort of thing for a very long time. So in today's session, which is part one of a two-part series, Viv and Julie will share an overview of the recent work, followed by a discussion about sense-making frameworks in general in complex facilitation, hopefully in particular, but really it's open to anything that you guys want to talk about. So we're hoping to get a lot of engagement from y'all. So Viv and Julie, welcome to the Complexity Lounge.
And thank you. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the various lands in which we meet and learn today. I'm on Turrbal country near Brisbane, Australia. I'd like to acknowledge the fact that lands have never been ceded and the traditional owners past, present and emerging. So thank you for the invitation for being here. And Julie will say a little about herself shortly, but what we'd really like to do today, brief introduction from Julie and I, a little about where we came from and what our current interests are, but more open this up to a chat in terms of what your interests might be. We haven't prepared a major PowerPoint presentation. What we prefer to do is have a Q&A, and then if there's material and information that we have that's useful, we'll send it on afterwards that you can have access to, rather than preempt what might be of interest. Surprise, surprise, this is a complexity process, which says, how dare we pretend we are experts and know exactly what it is that you want to know. We will allow this to be an emergent process in and of itself. So my background is that I started my world of work in the area of industrial relations and workplace reform. So I've always been in the world of systems change, way back in the 70s. And yes, I did do early work in places like the waterfront in Queensland, in Australia, introduction of containerisation into Australia, mining industry and so on. And so I've always been part of the world of change at a systems level. And my early influences came from work of people from the US, like Donald Shon, Beyond the Stable State. One of the things that always stuck with me was he said innovation only happens at the edge. The centre was always too tied up with bureaucracy, my words, constipated. So if you were going to do change, start at the edge and work your way in rather than trying to go direct to the middle. That was something that always stayed with me, amongst others. And a lot of work that was happening at that time in Europe, Swedish Centre for Working Life, OECD, and so on. And my mentor, the late Bill Ford, was an advisor to a whole range of things. So I didn't meet Dave and some of the formal complexity theory until 2000, but a lot of us had been doing work in this area in a variety of industries until then. My passion is, one of my passions is complex facilitation. That is, how do we engage the processes so that the people involved become part of their own journey and their own solutions, and that the role of the expert is one of enabler, not driver. Julie and I have been working together for some years. Currently, the things that I'm really interested that we're doing that may be of interest to you is our early stage partnership with our Indigenous colleagues here in Australia, creating third space processes, which is the integration of Indigenous knowledges with complexity processes. It's early days, but that looks like we're going to have some pretty interesting projects to work together on this year. It started last year. And the whole, how do you translate theory into real practice for non-professional facilitators, if you like, at a community level. But there are other things, and happy to explore whatever your interests might be. Julie.
Thanks, Viv. So my background is quite different to Viv's. I've come through with working in the organisation design, organisation development, leadership development space. Have spent over the last decade actually, studying in the discipline of neuro-leadership and how that informs how and what we do. So for me, the difference between individual versus collective work in this space is an area of continuing and ongoing both interest and development. So I across the areas that I've worked in, learning has also been an area that I've spent a fair bit of time working in and thinking about how you can form these into interesting curriculums, but also interesting learning experiences, either in person or online. And actually what that means. So I spent quite a bit of time and have a growing concern actually around access to curated and authenticated information and how that potentially informs and impacts what we do. So language is definitely an area of interest for me. The notion of complexity literacy is an interest. How do we introduce language? And I know Dave says he doesn't introduce terribly much different language. I think he would say that, yes, you have to have novelty. His view would be that the words he's introduced through Cynefin are not actually that many. And I think it's probably only Dave with the disciplines and the learning that he's done that could say it's not that many. It's probably not common, but you know, that notion of language and how you do that so it is inclusive, not exclusive, I think is just a really interesting thing to consider. And I think the other thing that I would say is interesting is how we think about starting conditions through the lens of complexity and what that means and what that affords and what sorts of things we take into consideration as we design things. I originally met Viv as a happy accident. I had been doing some work in the health space. I'd been called in to do a review of 3 discipline areas in a health space that were in significant conflict. So I had done that piece of work and had done that in quite a way that I would have thought was informed by complexity principles, but actually once I met Viv, I realised that yes, it was informed by what I thought were complexity principles at the time, but there were, you know, ways I could do that differently. And if I was doing it now, it would be quite different. But having done that piece of work and then 2 years later being approached to say, we've just reread your report and would you help us now to actually source a culture survey? And my response to that was, if you want a standard culture survey, I'm not your person. And then I met Viv around what was then Culture Scan as one of the offerings, and you're nodding your head there, Michael. So Culture Scan, and I went, surely there's got to be someone in Australia that I can talk to around this stuff. So having rung Viv and expecting to have a very short conversation, about an hour and a half later, we got off the phone, and that was in 2017. So since then, we have been working much more closely. And for me, I think that, you know, going to the space of how do we do this so that we consider what is minimal viable theory that needs to be in place to inform what you do as an intervention. I think it's just really interesting, and certainly informs what we're doing in that community activation space. And then how does that inform what we refer to as the notion of complexity literacy? If I could say, my passion would be if we can build this into something that informs what we do to teach in the K to 12 education space, that would be pretty darn exciting. We are working by stealth.
Yeah. Sorry, there's a question. What do I mean by third space? So the third space notion is with our Indigenous colleagues, and this would be true of any of the cross-cultural work. There are Indigenous knowledges, and there's what they call, they're very kind to us, they call us settlers, as opposed to those bastard invasion people. But anyway, the settler knowledge and the Indigenous knowledge. The third space is how do we combine to create a third space, which is not asking us to be like Indigenous people, and nor is it asking the Indigenous colleagues to be like us, but a third space which is combining of the knowledges where we can come together and work together with shared knowledges and facilitate, learn and operate collectively. So last year we ran a public workshop for the first time where we did that with complex facilitation methods. And we now have a partnership with two organisations in Australia. One is the Indigenous Knowledge Labs at Deakin University, and the second is a consulting company called Right Ways Wanju. And the intent would be that we now move that to doing some work with a specific project and develop those methods further, where we draw on the complexity theory and practice and the Indigenous knowledges and practice to come together and create some new methods, processes and approaches and use them in the field with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous cohorts. So that's third space. Yeah.
And the thing I'd add about that is the notion of context dependence.
Yeah.
Because its space here is how the Indigenous colleagues that we work with describe it. Yes. We also know that third space is not necessarily a descriptor that would be used in the same way outside of Australia.
Yep. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's a term that's been developed by Dr. John Davis, who's the Indigenous colleague that we're working with, and it's generally used in the Australian context. But yes, that's what it means. Yeah.
Yeah, but the concept is still valuable, I think, to carry across. Yeah, I mean, because I could certainly see within an organization how you would want to try to find those kinds of spaces between different departments, different groups, different.
Yes, and what it does is it makes clear that in context, it's not about trying to find one forcing or imposing a view on the other. It's what is it that can come up through the centre that's a combination of, absolutely. In the current context in Australia, making it as explicit as it is and acknowledging that there is a knowledge base that comes from Indigenous knowledges, capital I Indigenous knowledges, is important, so that the acknowledgement of both traditional and contemporary Indigenous knowledges will become part of what we do and how it gets recorded and then shared with others. So early days, but I think probably one of the things which is important is that they have acknowledged that the complexity processes are at this stage those that they see most compatible with the intent of empowerment and so on and so forth, and are consistent with what they would see as appropriate to use.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, while the rest of you are getting your questions together and getting ready to raise your hands, and I know you are, I'm going to ask a couple of questions or a question. I'm going to start with something that Julie talked about, which I think is really interesting, which is this idea of the individual in the system and how we tend to view things, and I don't know whether this is a particularly Western point of view, but we tend to view things through the lens of the individual, even when we're talking about the system. And I was wondering if you, Julie, I'll start with you since you brought it up. You know, how do you address that in organizations? How do you move people more towards a system level thinking about complex questions, or is it okay to remain at the level of the individual?
It's not an either or. I think it's a both and.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So in an organisation that we're doing some work with, it's a small not-for-profit, so it's not a large organisation. They've got about 30 people. We've been having conversations with them around they're not on the edge of chaos. They're actually on what I'm referring to as the cliff of complacency. Their view of when they are in a peak operating time, and my consideration of the difference in energy that you see when they're either busy or not busy, there doesn't seem to be a lot of difference to me between what is a peak time and what is just a relative downtime. So and they have some competitors, but not a whole lot of competitors, and they have been a very closed system. So so the ability to be able to provide input into different perspectives, and with Viv, so one of the things that we talk about is the difference between a project team and a learning team. So while I'm not necessarily using the language of project team, learning team in this context, the principles of being a learning team and actually providing them opportunities of opening the system up, and how we do that is informing how we are designing and redesigning the organisation. So they've introduced a trio approach to the largest team in the organisation. So they're now working in instead of it being one collective team of quite a number of probably half of the employees, it's now 3. We've talked about the notion of heuristics. So how they form heuristics that are check-ins. So they're questions. So we had a meeting on this week actually, where it was a lessons learning space. So how they actually do that as they're going through that. So introducing some notions that are informed by what we know are complexity principles that they haven't thought of before, and even just talking about the difference between role and how we form role based on function, not on person. They have organised themselves over the last decade based around personality, and they are now paying the price, if you like, for having had that. And some of it is because they haven't had to do anything different, and they've actually been quite successful financially. So the way that they have monitored their success and their need to do things differently has led to complacency. But if they don't leapfrog, in 2 years' time, they're not going to exist.
I'd follow up with that by agreeing with Julie that it has to be both and. But my view is that you have to start with understanding what needs to be different in the system in order to be able to open up the space for whatever investment you're doing with the people. And if I cycle back to my beginnings, if you like, in the world of industrial relations and workplace reform, where forever it was about if only the workers would be different, and if we needed this, we needed that, we needed whatever. But the systems itself contained the kind of behaviour and the sort of expectations. And so we if you're going to shift a culture and shift an environment, it needs both. And Julie mentioned the difference between learning teams and project teams as an example. So a project team sits in a traditional sense where you put an expert in charge of the project, and you have all of the systems about timelines and expectations and KPIs and so on and so on and so forth to drive to an outcome. And lots and you do that, and you have action plans and so on and so forth. Back in the 80s, when we were doing workplace reform, we introduced the notion of learning teams, which was that the experts weren't allowed to be in charge. They could be mentors, but they couldn't be on the team. The teams had to consist of people who typically didn't work together, so that you were increasing network density. You gave them a big fat thing to look at rather than a specific thing. So when we did the culture change at the Sydney Opera House, we had learning teams which consisted of people inside the Opera House and outside who would never work together normally. But darling, we're from the theatre. We don't talk to those people out there that do maintenance. I mean, let's be clear, yeah, right? But we deliberately put them together. This is inside a very unionised environment where every time a show was about to open on a Friday night, the Industrial Commission would sit waiting for the dispute to be called, because that was maximum leverage, right? I mean, it may have looked all glossy on the outside, but behind the scenes, let me tell you, it was a hotbed of nastiness. So we put together people who would never normally work together, and we gave them topics like go and find 6 good ideas about improving the customer experience, but you're not allowed to visit another entertainment industry. So all of the things about opening up the minds, perspective shift, having people work together who don't normally work together, et cetera, were built into an industrial agreement inside a traditional system. Yeah. And you've got 3 months to do it, and you will come back and you will say to the Board of Trustees of the Sydney Opera House, here are 5 good ideas we think we should try. And they looked at us and said, but how could anybody teach the Opera House anything? And we said, where are the other large organisations that have large numbers of people who have to manage customer? Go to the international terminal, go to large sporting venues who have to manage large numbers of people and make sure. And all of a sudden, open up the eyes, see new perspectives, put different groups of people together, and the experts, including union officials and so on, are not allowed to be on the teams. Because what I said to them was, you're far too important to have your time on there. You can have the power of veto at the other end. So we stopped all of the nonsense about you can't do this and you can't do that at the early stages. They were pulled right back out of the process till the end. Now, that whole process of our learning team, which now, umpty years later, I can see sits firmly and squarely into the whole how do you do innovation and change and new ideas and so on and so forth in complexity. We were doing in the 80s and 90s in culture change in all sorts of environments in the Australian system, and I still use it. Because what it does is it does all of those things about open up the perspective, increase the intensity of networks, get people to have to talk to people that they haven't met before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's taking those principles, but it's putting the individual and the collective and the system together at the same time in the same place. And we had some learning coordinators that helped resource the team, but they were internal people. They weren't external consultants telling them what to do or where to go and how to make it happen. So the whole thing was about increasing the capacity and the capability and the resilience of the organisation all the way through. So they're the sorts of things that if you're serious about how do we think about making things not only change but are consistently appropriate and coherent to the context of the organisation that you're working with, you can take a set of principles, and I can talk about how we applied those at the Sydney Opera House, to ICI Botany, to a mining industry, and to an organisation in Cambodia. The principles are the same, but you modify them a little to the context, and it's all about making sure that what you're doing is combining. It's not about taking people away and only being concerned about their mindset or their capability frameworks or whatever, and nor is it all about going and doing untold numbers of process analysis of workflows. It's about seeing it as an integrated system, and constantly making sure that what you're doing is being is supporting it on that kind of basis and enabling it. Now, we did those sorts of things inside a very rigid, compliant industrial relations system. So when people say you can't do it, because I say, well, you can, because we have, and we did. And we did it in the mining industry and a whole range of other places. But it does require a different way of thinking about it. And it's not about being an expert consultant writing a report, which sits on a desk. Anyway,
Yeah.
So it's both and.
Yeah. Julie, I'm impressed that it was only 2 years that they waited before they came back and said, can you help us?
Some don't ever come back at all, of course.
Yeah, sometimes I can't even remember who it was I spoke to. I mean, for me, one of the interesting parts of this too is that, and this is something I've observed in a couple of different contexts, is that when we're talking about this, the idea that the lens of the individual is that you begin to miss in complex systems those interactions and their impact on the system when you define them in terms of the individual. Does that make sense? And the individual actors and agents in a system, as opposed to the impact on the system.
Go again, sorry.
Okay, you're gonna make me say it again. What I see is that, like, when we focus, when the focus of the lens is to the individual, and we're looking at the interactions in a system, it tends to reduce the impact of those interactions on to the level of the individual, as opposed to the effect of the impact of the interactions on the system.
Yeah.
So what comes to mind for me there is the notion of granularity and the notion of interdependence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so what level are we looking at, and what does that mean in terms, because it's not about not looking at it at the level of the role. You know, what does it mean for the role and what that might mean, but it's also about the interdependencies at the level of the system. So the organization, the small organization, the customer mapping, the customer journey mapping they have done is impressive. It doesn't tell me anything, but it's impressive. And the consultant that came in and did the work spent months doing this. I mean, it takes an entire wall, right? And I've said, okay, walk me through and tell me what that actually tells you. I have not had someone tell me the same thing when they've walked me through that. And tell me where, you know, tell me where the interdependencies are, and tell me how what that means in terms of, and by the way, tell me what your customers have told you around that, because this is a customer journey map. Do you know how many inputs they've had around what the customer would actually like to think about that? Exactly, 0. So again, it's and so I've been sort of saying, so what data do you have that informs that? What data do you have that informs that? You know, the notion of data that informs that. You can see SenseMakers going in here, right? So I mean, literally, they are going to be doing some collection. And by the way, you know, doing the work that we do with the Indigenous, we change the words that we use. We don't use the word capture because we can't use the word capture.
You got into trouble for that.
We use the word collect and gather. So we are also changing what would be common language through some of the tools and methods that we use, that we don't use anymore because of the work that we're doing with our Indigenous colleagues. We use the word weave. So, you know, we weave a lot of, so we are also changing the language that we're using with the work that we're doing. And that's a big one. So we do, if we use the word that I've said that we can't use, I note to myself, oh my gosh, I've said it again and I shouldn't. So yes, so the collecting of data that actually helps to inform that, and this is a health space, so you know they have analytics up the yin yang, but is that actually what it needs to tell them? in a lot of cases, it's not.
I guess where I would go with what you were asking is this. I think it's setting the environment that enables the people who are in that space to do the detailed, if you like, management of the individual stuff. So a couple of other examples I'd use. Some time ago, there was a very creative guy, the late Mike Blackwell, who had been a mining manager in a variety of places, and he had an opportunity for a greenfield site, and he put a group of us together and said, there's got to be a better way of running a mine. It's got to be nothing like anywhere I've been before. It has to be, unionised. It has to meet all of the compliance and so on and so forth. But there has to be a better way of running a mine. And I was fortunate to be one of the people put into this room for a week to try and do the design. And we had someone from the unions and a variety of other of us in there. One of the things that we did was abandon all of the regular long lists of all of the what I call the bags of shoulds around behaviour codes that dominated the mining industry at the time. And we came up with a single statement. Everyone on this mine site will be fair, safe and honest. That was it. And that applied to everyone, top to bottom, managers, workforce, contractors, anybody who came onto the mine site had to sign on to that. And then the only other thing and if you found somebody or you had a complaint, this is what you did, and within an hour a group would be formed to consider the conversation, what would happen, and so on and so on and so forth. Now that replaced a huge amount of previously compliance-driven things around the way things had to happen on the mine site. But it also meant that what happened in the mill was different to what happened on the mine site on the open cut, and could be different to what happened in that. So we knew back then, without having the language for it, that context was important. And people needed to be able to manage the specifics of individual behaviour in their own context by themselves, not by a whole group of other people telling them what they should do and how they should be and what they should look like and so on and so forth. But the interactions were governed by a set of agreed principles. Yeah. So again, it's a both and. It's what level do we want to. Now, I go to another example where if an organisation wants to change some behaviours. So this is a government department in Queensland, and they wanted their engineers to be much more customer focused, client focused out there building roads. Now, typically what would happen is that you ping all the engineers and you give them 2 days training on how to be nice to the community and send them out, done tick. Yeah. And expect the behaviour to change? Probably not. Now, two things are really important. One is we knew that out there in the country, they were probably doing it anyway, because as we know, further you get away from bureaucracy in the head office, all sorts of interesting, innovative behaviour happens, but you never get to know about it. And secondly, if you looked at what it was that currently told an engineer they were a good engineer, where was it in the reporting anywhere that said listening to customers or the community was important? There was nothing. Absolutely nothing. So training the engineers to be nice to the community or listen to them was going to achieve nothing unless you changed the system. So change the system and say each engineer now had to report on how many innovations and good ideas have informed the project as a result of feedback from the community, and how many of those have they handed on to their colleagues. Put those two things into the reporting system of what now equals a good engineer in main roads. All of a sudden, lots of people wanted to learn about how do you communicate with the community and how do you and so the whole thing shifted. So it's both and. But if you don't do the system as well as, then you're not going to get it. And my experience would be if you don't start with challenging the system, the amount of time and effort and energy and frustration that builds up by simply trying to get the individual to be the best person they can be inside an environment that doesn't support it is, I think, unethical. Truly, I think it's unethical. And it's probably why I've been self-employed for 50 years, because people like me aren't allowed full-time inside an organisation saying things that I do long, loud and often. But I really do think it's unethical. I'm not anti the development of people, but I really do think it's important that you do it in an ethical and moral way, in an environment that supports. I walked into an environment where, you know, it's also about the measurement stuff. So here's the performance measurement thing about we like our customers, we will answer a call in 3 minutes after 3 rings. So here's people in the call centre talking to someone with a hand on another phone after every 3 rings, terminating the call. They're meeting their performance objective, which is the call is answered in 3 rings. It doesn't say you have to talk to the customer. It doesn't say you have to solve their problem. It simply says it will be answered in 3 rings. They are meeting the performance objective.
Viv, I can't believe that one of the, performance metric agencies hasn't snapped you up.
Well, it's because at the end of the day, it's easier to then, it's like those crazy, the last thing I did, which was a piece of sheer bastardry on my part, I guess. You know those things where you leave and there's you can tick the thing about how satisfied you are on an emoji thing.
Yeah.
So I was leaving a healthcare environment, and you could do the emoji thing, and there was a mother with a young toddler. So I picked up the toddler and I said, you go for it. So he's having the best time across the party. Come on. What on earth does feedback around a 5-thing emoji of a large number of people leaving a healthcare, multi-story healthcare thing, what does it do? It gives no context whatsoever. So hopefully I destroyed their metrics for the day, because the toddler had the best time. I made sure that he was pretty evenly distributed across the 5 things. I mean, it's exactly the same system that's in the Changi public toilets in Singapore airport, for crying out loud. What sorts of feedback of any relevance do metrics like that actually provide that have any kind of real meaning to them is beyond me. But anyway, every now and then I've been known to be not a good citizen.
Now Josephine has put a question in the chat.
Yes.
Josephine, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, or would you like one of us to read it for you?
I can do it. Thank you for asking. I'll regenerate.
Sorry, you have to go, Mike. Sorry, I had to say goodbye to Mike.
Okay, Mike, see ya.
So what are the signs and/or signals for Viv that an organization is ready to talk to someone like us about being ready for change? And I wrote as a sort of a semi-snarky second question, how desperate do they have to appear?
Look, my experience is that it's either one or the other. I have been fortunate in my career to have had what I would call kind of natural complexity workers, or mavericks, or in the Australian vernacular, ratbags, who have wanted to do something different. And over the years, there's been a number of those who have provided opportunities, like the Mike Blackwells, who out of sheer frustration have said there has got to be a better way, and have provided the opportunities to do it. So there are those people. There have been circumstances where organisations have been instructed. So I've been called into environments where organisations where the environment has been so toxic, in an industrial relations environment, for example, that they've been given no choice but to have to tackle and do some things that are different. And that has happened in a number of occasions. And then there are those circumstances where, and sometimes it's not a whole organisation, and I'm often much happier when it's a small part. Julie's mentioned the health sector. In a number of circumstances, it will be only a small part of a larger system, rather than trying to take on the whole system. In my experience, it's if you find a hospital as part of a larger deal, or a business unit, rather than trying to do the whole organisation. Because being able to demonstrate what's different, demonstrate the advantages of doing things differently, rather than talking about it. I was saying to a group of people the other day, I've rarely won a tender, I think, in 50 years of self-employment, because writing about this stuff and talking about it is not something that people either A, instantly grapple, or B, say, I've got to have some of that. It's either too scary or too innovative or too whatever, or show me 50 other organisations that have done it so that if it goes wrong, my ass is covered, etc., etc., etc. I sometimes have been known to say to an organisation, if there's a person in there who wants to do things differently but are having problems convincing, I'll say, give me half a day, 15 people, free of charge. I'll run a half-day session using some complex methods around a complex problem, and if at the end of it, it is of no value to you, we can part friends. If at the end of it, it looks like what I can offer has some value, then we can talk about where it might go next. Because in my experience, complexity, the principles of they learn by doing, not by talking about it, if it's not something that is instinctive. And as Gary knows, when we did the work with FIA, with the Food Industry Authority, trying to talk about it just about drove everybody. But the first time we managed to actually get a group of people in a workshop working with the whole thing shifted. So finding the opportunity where people experience, even if it's only for an hour or two, a different way of working with a complex problem, using some of the processes and the techniques without getting too engaged with the theory. One of the things I learned early on is that just because I get excited about the theory doesn't mean everybody else does. I used to bore my family and anybody else who was near me completely and utterly witless. And that the most important thing is you know the theory and know what you're doing and why, but it doesn't mean that everybody else has to in the first instance. That in fact you can do a whole range of these sorts of things without people actually having to necessarily engage with the theoretical constructs. And this is the stuff Julie's talking about, complexity literacy, or the work that we're doing, making these things accessible and available to community, what we're calling community activators, so that they can work with their own communities, use the methods and the principles, but don't necessarily have to be thoroughly imbued with the theory. So the learning by doing is really important, and then people get to an aha and want to know more, and it moves on, and it moves on from there. Often I'm asked to do some, well, not so much now, but in the earlier days I'd be asked to do something and I would just sneak it in without telling people that's what I was doing. I have been known to do that. I think the dilemma at the moment, however, is that there are a whole range of things purporting to be about complexity that aren't, because it's now fashionable. It was actually a little easier when it wasn't, but now it's fashionable, and there's a whole range of organisations and consulting firms, etc., purporting to provide the answer to complexity. And I guess for me, the definition that Robert Poley's work is, which is you don't solve a complex problem, you learn to dance with it, is the definition that I will always use. You don't solve it, you dance with it, you nudge it, you pirouette. Some bits may spin off and be resolved for a bit, but the complex problem in and of itself it always remains. And so I think that trying to reduce it down to something which can get packaged and made simplistic is the dilemma that is facing a number of us at the moment. I think the other thing I would do is that I think around, are people ready for this? Part of the other entry point, and I'm sure Michael would agree with me on this, part of the other entry point is around the issue of data. And if you have an organisation who wants to collect a lot of data and you can get them interested in using SenseMaker, for example, that then enables you to come in to do other things. So having the data as the enabler to then raise other issues around complexity and complex facilitation processes, around how people engage with the data and so on. So part of it's the entry point. The work I've ever done in health, I've never been able to do a whole system, and I wouldn't want to. Parts of the system, yes. I'm not sure if that helps.
The other thing that I would add is we have in the community activator space, we are grappling with what we're referring to as the on-ramps. Right? What are actually the on-ramps that that are going to be resonant for people? And so risk is probably one. You know, monitoring, measurement and monitoring potentially is another. We're also having some interesting conversations in the whole area of commissioning and procurement. So generating some scenarios that are resonant, that sort of cover those areas, is what we're grappling with at the moment in the on-ramp, if you like, for the community activator space. So some of that too is, you know, what are the discussions to have through those different lenses that are going to lead to people being, you know, yes, I'm ready to come in and, you know, do the session, and if it doesn't work, part friends. Risk is often it's not a bad place to start, at the very least, to sort of test.
Michael's asked the question about complex facilitation and online or hybrid.
Let's have Michael unmute himself and join the conversation.
Talk to me. Come
on, Michael. No
worries. I was just like within the last few years that all of us have been through and just been chucked into, you know, online and even large workshops. And I know you and Julie do a lot of really effective facilitation. So just share some, you know, experiences, tips, do's, don't do's, right? What's worked well? What are the limits in your experience? So I'd love to hear that.
Okay, so yes, there's a couple. There are a number of things that are in the don't do in the complex facilitation space in terms of the virtual environment. So a couple of things first around complex facilitation and its difference, which is of course that when you're doing the complex facilitation work, you're managing the process, not the content. You're the enabler. And the meaning emerges from the activities of the group itself. So it's a very different set of expectations in terms of the role of the facilitator. And so there are some things which you can do when you're in face-to-face space that you just can't do virtually. So the first thing is the technology that you use is now whether you use Miro or Mural or Concept Board or whatever it is, a number of the cohorts that we have worked with have variable technology capability. The group that had the worst capability of all were a group of senior executives in an insurance company and a finance company. They were incompetent. So all of the planning and whatever came to a complete and utter splat when it was clear that they had no technical capability. It was a hybrid, but they didn't have the technical capability to do anything at all technologically. So we had to rejig that and give them a scribe, which was the last thing I would have thought about for what was theoretically a sophisticated, touch me for, spank me for making assumptions. So the first thing I would say around working in, which should be obvious but wasn't to us, was about the whole issue about the technology and the capability. We've landed on using Concept Board as one of the simplest of those. There may be others, our backup guy Malcolm has got tips and tricks on the board and made it as easy as possible to be able to do that. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that we have reduced the number of techniques that we use, the processes that we use. We've reduced it down, and there are some that we simply don't use in a virtual space. So we don't use ritual descent. We don't do even future backwards on a virtual. Anything that requires a lot of constant encouragement that you would be doing in a face-to-face space, of reminding people and so on, we don't do in a virtual space. Even though you can drop instructions in, it doesn't work as well. So we've reduced the number of methods and techniques that we use. We find that people get very confused about being moved in the moment around. So we do much more of bring them back to the main room and explaining what we're going to do next. Because even if you drop instructions in, it doesn't mean that they've actually seen them or heard them or whatever. So there's much more in and out of explaining what's happening, and it goes. I think it's fair to say, Julie, we go at a slower pace than in a virtual than we would do in a face to face. We go at a slower pace, and I am much more conscious, Michael, of how much we can do in a session. Much more conscious of breaking it up, of doing this and then giving people time to go away, digest, talk to each other, and then come back and do another piece, go away and then do another piece. And much more conscious of needing to have a partnership of people within the organisation who can do the bridging work and do the tidy up, if you like, between the sessions. That's much more important when you're doing the virtual. What it does do is make it very clear that we as external facilitators can't have anything to do with the content because we've got no ruddy idea what's going on. You can't listen in. You're very deliberate. So in that sense, it's much clearer. But setting up the role and the mandate and the relationship between what's happening in the client with us or with the other consultants who may be there. The things that others say. Sorry, yeah. Julie?
I was going to say the other thing is that we have Malcolm.
Yes.
Who provides, Malcolm is our technical support person who is on anything that we do virtual, and he is our naive asset. He doesn't know a whole stack of stuff around the complexity theory itself. So we will sometimes send Malcolm as a technical person to a room if we're not seeing terribly much activity in terms of the monitoring that we do of Concept Board, because you do monitor the system but using Concept Board. If we don't see a lot of activity for a period of time, a naive asset, neither Viv nor I go to the room, but we send a naive asset just to make sure there are no technical issues. So we have those ways. We wouldn't do that in physical space, but we do that in technical space.
We then harvest everything, obviously, make it available. So we support a virtual facilitation either on our own platform in Mighty Networks or on a platform of the clients, so that they have an opportunity to then see and read it and come to the next session. So it's a much more staged event if we're doing it virtually. So people have then time to think and reflect and do things. We've done the sort of session, Michael, you know, where people bring things in and roam around. So one of those that we did was putting up their results that came out of a employee survey, getting people to roam. So anecdote circles, roam, theme, mapping, clustering, all of those sorts of things that we've done. But there is no way I would try and do anything like estuarine mapping virtually. I wouldn't do future backwards. It just doesn't, it gets to be a little challenging around that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, good.
I also haven't, to be honest, haven't done a lot of stuff that I have done face-to-face, of having very large groups mixed in potentially high conflict environments, like when I did the one for with foster children, foster parents, judges, bureaucrats, etc., all in one room. There is no way I would do that virtually, because I can't feel what's happening to be able to make the adjustments. There are some assignments I wouldn't take on virtually because I don't have the confidence to be able to know, feel, and be able to react quickly enough to manage the space. So for me, it's much more with, that's not to say there aren't some power issues and things, but need to be a deal that I feel I can contain. But some of the ones that I've done face-to-face like that, like the one where there were Indigenous not-for-profits being defunded, and we had all the people connected with that system in the one room, 200 of them. There's no way I do those sorts of things virtually.
Andrea has a related question to that, if I can interrupt you, Viv. Andrea, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, or do you want me to?
No, that's fine.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Just wondering about, because I've been dealing with a lot of high conflict, and you mentioned toxic systems, and Julie, you said at the beginning that you were brought in to deal with some high conflict situations and you would do it differently now. And it kind of ties back to the individual versus the system. So how does that, is there systems you would say, oh, the complex is too much, we need to deal with the conflict first, or how does that impact how you take on this kind of work?
I deal with conflict in a complex way. And so one of the frame that I use comes from the work of Will Schutz, Human Element. I don't know whether any of you know Will's work. His frame is around accountability for anything. It goes like this. In any given situation, everyone's responsible, no one's to blame. Everybody could have done something to make a difference. Doing nothing is no excuse. Now, that's where I start, and I've used it in industrial environments and all sorts of environments. In other words, this is not about the blame game. This is about understanding what is as a basis to be doing something different and not having it happen again. So it can be as toxic and it can be as conflict-ridden as we want. But what we're doing is, because the principle of complexity is understand the current state as the basis of it being different. Now, if you're not here to be agreeing that what we want to do is change the current state to being different, then don't be here and I'll leave, right? And I've made that very clear in a number of conflict environments. If all you want to do is play the blame game, then that's fine, I'm out of here. But if we're here to understand the current state as the basis for making a difference for all of you, then we can stay and we can do some things that are different. And so then there's a variety of things that you can do. So one of them is the classic future-focused question. Imagine it's 2 years' time. What stories about, what experiences about this current situation would you like to be having? Imagine it's 2 years' time. What experiences about this current situation are you afraid you will still be having? So now I've got people having to anchor into their own experience, telling their stories about fears and aspirations, which is not about blame game. It's about anchoring them back into their own stuff, about their own experience, but it's the experience about the system and the issue, right? Not just about them. Then we do some cluster, we do that as an anecdote circle in silence, we cluster, we theme, we do all that kind of deal, and then we do so what needs to be different to get you to more like this and less like that. And I've done that around ambulance ramping and all sorts of things where people were just hurling abuse at each other. So it stops the blame game stuff and moves to, if this is where we are, but it's not an idealized vision, it's clearly about what is it about the current situation and what you're feeling and so on and so forth. So that's one of the processes that I've used. Julie, what would you do differently now?
Sorry, I was just typing. I was typing a response as we were going. We actually had a conversation around this last week in the complex facilitation space, and we were talking about the difference between conflict. There are different sorts of conflicts. So the difference between a substantive conflict and an emotional conflict. So substantive conflict is one that is around task allocation, resource, or potentially people who aren't prepared to compromise on work positions. And an emotional conflict is one that arises around differences around personalities or perspectives. So actually figuring out what you think the potential source of conflict is with some data that informs that, and then using the heuristics that Viv has spoken through. I would say I sort of did that, but I didn't do that with the clarity that I would do that now. And definitely the heuristic of everyone's responsible, no one's to blame, everybody contributed, and just sort of looking at how those heuristics can inform what you do. Because we've been in the health space, as you know, they are trained to be specialists, and they are trained to make very quick decisions in very high pressure situations. And they're trained to critique. And there is quite, there's a fine, and it's also the same in the small not-for-profit that I'm working in. They're actually trained to critique. But when critiquing can feel critical, there's a fine line between critical and critique. And what's the conflict in that? The conflict in that, it's both potentially substantive and emotional, but it might be more one than the other. So
the other one, yeah.
Sorry, go.
Julie, I was going to say the other one that Julie and I have used quite a bit, the other framework that we've used is the Meg Wheatley six-circle lens.
Yeah.
To shift it to another space. And that's the six-circle lens, which says the three non-rational, not irrational, non-rational lens are purpose and identity. So what are we here for? And we can send this through. So what are we here for? What's the identity we want to be known for? What's the nature and quality of the relationships that we want? And information. Information is an emotional, non-rational thing. Who needs to know what from whom in order for this group to be successful or for this issue to be resolved? And then what are the systems, processes and policies that need to be in place? Now, mostly when people are looking to change something or do something differently, they start above the line with the rational stuff. What system needs to be different, what process needs to be different, and the things that trip it up are all of the non-rational emotive things that sit underneath. Now, that particular framework I've used if we go back to the health system, there was a group of, in an orthopaedic group of 25 different nationalities. Now, to be able to run the conversation which says, what is the shared identity and purpose of this department? meant that whether they were from and you know there were doctors there from Germany and Sri Lanka and India and Australia and Great Britain and all over the place, they could at least come together. This is this individual versus collective. They could come together with a collective view of what was the identity and purpose of the department, as well as having their own individual ego as orthopaedic surgeons. And it enables, again, that individual and collective conversation to get to some kind of shared basis to then be able to move to, and then what's the nature and quality of the relationships that we want with each other, with other parts of the hospital, and what's the information flow? Who needs to know what? And what we know to be true is that information is fundamentally about trust. And if you ask me for information and I don't know where it goes, what you're really telling me is you don't trust me. You may not know that that's how I feel, but certainly in the Australian context, we know that it's about trust. It may be in other environments. Australia is the one I know best. Now, just having those sorts of conversations inside that kind of framework releases a whole bunch of things. So part of my approach is always to find a structure or a framework or some scaffolding that allows people to have a different kind of conversation, but it is all about understanding the current state as the basis for being able to then say, well, what do we want to do differently in order to move us along to a place that's going to be better than where we are now? And how will we know that we're making the kind of progress that we want? Yeah, so both of those are things that I've used reasonably often over the years.
Yeah, I like those approaches as well, because, you know, one of the things I often run into is that when I try to assess the starting conditions or the present state of an organization, they report their self-reporting is often about some glorious past or some fabulous future. You know, if you ask them what's happening right now, they either start to reference some, you know, glorious episode from the past or some amazing future that's just around the corner. And that is, you know, it's part of the problem with grounding them in defining their problems and make X great again. Yeah. Thank you, Oren. Finding, you know, helping them along the path to solution when they can't really get their heads around what's actually going on.
Absolutely. And if somebody could find the skill, the trigger that stops people evaluating and gets them to describe, that would be magic and gold. Right? It's again this issue about we're taught to critique and evaluate and give opinions when to be really effective in the complexity space, the first thing we need is people to describe what is happening. I don't want your opinion. I don't want to evaluate. I want to describe what's going on right now. I want you to describe what you see. I want you to describe what's going on. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges for a whole lot of people, and particularly if you're working with a bunch of experts, whether it's in the health space or whether it's a bunch of experts in an engineering environment or whatever it is that it might be, getting them to stop evaluating or having the opinion and saying, no, what is happening? Not what should, not what could, not what might, what is it. And we need to understand the current state. The second thing about that is we never will know everything. And that is also a challenge for experts. When you say to them, listen, we're not going to know everything. We can't possibly know everything there is to know. It's about knowing enough so we can reach agreement about doing something, because we're not ever going to know it all. Now, that's guaranteed to send some of the people I know into a state of a reasonable amount of panic and conniption, which in answer to the complexity principles, yes, I'll send through a list of the thing that there are some fundamental principles that we always fall back on, Jadina, so I'll send those through so they can become part of the deal.
Yeah, I would like to say that we at the lounge do love some experts.
Oh, well,
we have,
okay.
We have nothing against them as a class of individuals.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. And yes,
And you've been hearing a range of principles as we go through. Context dependence is a principle. Bounded applicability is a principle. So you've been hearing them as we'll go through, but we'll put them into.
We'll put the list out. And yes, the reference to Will Schultz, his book is called The Human Element. He did a whole lot of work around people and organisational, and one of his instruments is FIRO-B, the fundamental interpersonal relationship orientation dash behaviour. But some of his work about people in organisations, I had the fortune before of doing 10 days with him many years ago. Some of his principles about understanding behaviour in context, I've just found consistent and coherent with some of this work and find it useful. Yeah. So where else were we?
Jocko, you've been oddly silent. Do you have anything to add to this conversation? He can't unmute himself.
No, I have plenty to add. No, I was responding to some messages on the meetup page, actually. This is fantastic. You don't need me to rake your flow. So no, keep going.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so
there is a question from Kyle before mine.
Yes. Yeah.
Go.
Yeah, I'll just speak to it.
Yeah, Kyle, let's go.
It's buried in there somewhere. So I love this idea of the minimum viable theory. I'm definitely one of those people that has been trying to explain why process management and even service design is really problematic in all scenarios. And so when I learned Cynefin, I said, I can't wait to go back and tell everyone why they're wrong and why this will work. And I actually went to one of your complexability meetups maybe 2-3 years ago and watched somebody go through the process of self-discovering why that wasn't the case. It was a very patient 12 rounds that you took them through. It was wonderful. I think since then, I've been able to relate at a very human level and bring in a lot of those people that are attracted and curious about this and get the we deal with complexity every single day. We just thought that we didn't have to between 9 and 5. That's not the case. Well, now I think we're getting to that next level of, okay, I'm ready to invest in this. I'm going to spend time on this. I'm going to put my neck out and I'm going to bring other more senior people into the table. Like, now show me what I'm going to get from this. I have to deliver results. Can you predict and guarantee something out of this? And now I'm starting to go, okay, now I got really good at pulling everyone into a conversation. Now I'm having a little bit of a difficult time figuring out what's this next level of language to speak to that question.
Okay, so the clue is that predict and guarantee belongs to the world of certainty. And if they want to live in the world of certainty, then that's not the world of complexity. Okay, so the language of the world so here are some of the difference in the language that I find helpful. Yes, you can measure, but you can also monitor. So what I can help you do is monitor the things that you can't measure. What are the things that trip us up because we can't measure them? But what complexity helps you do is monitor them. So there's a difference between, it's both and world, so we can measure and we can monitor the bits that trip us up because the plan's always, there isn't a plan. So the classic example I use is I say to people, tell me about your budgeting process. How long does it take to do the strategic plan and the annual budget? What resources do you think it consumes? And 12 months on, how much of what you predicted was actually true? How much time, effort, energy, and resources do you think it took to tap dance or blog breaststroke through blancmange or panic of all dealing with all of the unexpected stuff that came along because you set in stone a process, a thing that you believed was going to be the world the way it was? How about we do some things which is both and that stuff that you do know, you've got all of the things in place to do that bit, but hey, I've got stuff that helps you manage the bit. And get them to reflect on the last 1, 2, 3 years of all of the unexpected bits that if they'd had some things in place would have made life easier to manage, to monitor, to deal with, to cope with. So I always embed it in their reality. Tell me the stories of the thing that came from left field that was unexpected. What happened? What impact did it have? Wouldn't it have been better if we'd had a whatever it was in place, something in place that gave us an advance warning or a different approach to risk or whatever it is? Find the thing out of the toolkit bucket of stuff around complexity that would have them to say, you know, if we'd had one of those, wouldn't life have been better, been easier, been whatever? So it's about finding the thing that you've got in the complexity toolkit, right? The tools, the methods, the processes that you would then be able to say, I can't guarantee you the future exactly. What I can guarantee is that if any of these things ever happen again, and of course they won't in exactly the same way, but if something like this happens again, we'll deal with it a damn sight better than we did before. That's what I can guarantee. But if you want guaranteed certainty, hey, go somewhere else, because that's not the world in which we live. You know that's not the world in which we live. So we can talk about impact. We can talk about a different approach to risk. So one of the ones that I find most helpful in the health space is the definition of risk. Risk in a complex world, you can't avoid things going wrong. We know that. You know that. Every day of the week, you know that. I say that to people. But it's about early detection, excellence in recovery. So I say to an organisation, what's your scanning and detection systems like? Or do you have to wait till it slaps you in the bush and then you go into a panic to work out what to do with it? Early detection processes and scanning systems, that's complexity, my friend. Would you like to talk about how we might do some of that better than you currently are? Because that's what complexity is about in your world. Yeah?
Yeah, that all resonates.
Or at a really simple level in a health system, in an emergency department, a head of emergency said to me one day, I know it's going to be a really good shift when it comes on and I see people helping each other without being asked. And I said to him, your job is to make that happen every shift. If that's the indicator of what a good shift is going to be, then your job as the leader is to make that happen every shift, because that's the indicator of a healthy system. So again, I would say to you, Carl, in your organisation, what are the indicators of a healthy, resilient system? And what is it that we need to do to monitor when they're starting to go wobbly boot? And that's monitoring on impact. That your traditional measuring and monitoring and guarantee me the stuff is not going to deal with that stuff. So it's that kind of next language and conversation about whatever industry that you're working in. So it's the language of impact, it's the language of monitoring, it's the language of resilience, and so on and so forth. So it's finding the things that make sense in your context, and when the eyes light up, burrow in, grab them and don't let them go. Yeah, and you'll find, and it will be different for different ones of the ones that will capture their interest. Yeah.
And sort of a little bit of a follow up to that, because what's kind of fascinating to me is that having access to the language, being able to explain this, having the intuition to sort of know that something is off and that there's something to this is one thing. But being able to get in front and confidently say this is the case, we're going down a very different path than where we've always been. And getting a team around, we've been writing 3-bullet executive summaries for our entire careers. And if we don't have one in hand and we can't summarize this in 3 minutes, then they're going to laugh us out of the room and our career's in jeopardy at that point. Like, getting them rallied around, we're going to go in and say, no, it's going to be different this time, is really difficult. The community of practice that I run in my organization I consider it more of a support group of like, we're actually onto something here. But like, are you finding that there's that component to this as well?
Absolutely. And so part of the deal finally is there one person in your senior executive group who gets it more than others?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So it's finding the champion.
Yep.
Inviting them to your community of practice, or getting them talking to people in other parts of the system, helping them, asking them to help you to find the story, to find the leverage point, to be ready. It's what I call planned spontaneity, right? You're ready to be opportunistic at the time that it presents itself. But you need to find so that you're not doing the pitch in the normal way, right? What you are is ready, that when an opportunity presents, you can come in behind it. So it might be, for example, Kyle, that the next time there's a crisis of whatever ilk, or there's something that's unexpected that happens, you are ready with a set of processes that can move in at the same time, that can demonstrate what this stuff can do. You're not going to get them to buy in advance. It's this principle that says, do it, and then you can talk afterwards about what you did and why you did it and how it fits, and they'll have the grand aha. Yeah. My experience would be, that's what I say, be prepared. When we did the stuff that we did way back in the industrial relations environment and so on, I no more pitched to the unions the things that I pitched to the unions were things like, are you going to say I can't help your members learn new stuff? Is that what you're telling me? You have to be in control of everything because your members aren't allowed to learn. You're prepared for me to go to the Industrial Commission and say, you're against your members learning new things. Well, I mean, I had them, right? So I wasn't saying to them, I am going to introduce a new product. So it's about being ready so that when you then at the end afterwards, the aha will happen. So you need to be ready in your environment, whatever it is that might happen next, to have a set of processes or methods, or whether it's a lessons. So it might be taking up the lessons learning approach. Look, this is happening. Let's move in quickly, put 2 people there, be capturing the story, collecting the stories. You see, I said capture, hit yourself in the head, collecting the stories, doing it differently, a whole host of things be ready for. And then afterwards, you can explain why you did it that way, why it was different, what's the outcome, and have the aha. Probably the thing, Westpac Bank some years ago, something went pear-shaped in one of their big things, high embarrassment, and they moved into their traditional analysis, and would have taken 3 months, what went wrong, etc., etc. A colleague of mine was working in there at the time, pulled together 50 people. We did a 1-day lessons learned, and at the end of the day, using Cunningham, etc., go to the CEO and said, this is what will happen next time, so it won't happen again. So he had in 1 day, as opposed to a 3-month analysis and blame game traditional analysis of what went wrong, etc., etc., etc. That shifted Westpac's acceptance of complexity. Became both and. but it was demonstration of what it could do. There was no way trying to pitch it was ever going to work. Now, if you've got a champion up there who knows, then that's helpful so that they, right? But I'm the old and bold here. This comes from many years of trying. That would be, if there's a take-home message, it's be ready to do, and better to ask for forgiveness and permission any day. Mind you, I'm as a self-employed person, the only person who can sack me is me, I guess. Oh, Julie could. Can you sack me, Julie? Probably.
Oh dear. So Josephine had asked a question, how do you distinguish between monitoring and measuring? I think we covered that. Josephine, do you feel like that's been answered in what Viv has said so far?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. And then the next question is, we've had some raised hands that have come in and out.
Well,
Becky.
I got one that I'd like to jump on is I'd love to hear more about how you've applied complexity to org design. That's one of particular interest to me. We could probably go on all night about that one, but
yeah. Okay, but very, very quickly, I mean, I absolutely agree with Dave that it's not about destroying hierarchies and so on. But so 3 examples come to mind. One was the work that we did in the mining industry, where we created a team-based structure where the principles of what needed to be in a team were based on were based on roles, so that every shift needed, for example, 3 people who knew how to drill and 2 who knew to know how to blast, etc., etc., etc. And then we handed over to the group themselves to work out who would be on what shift and even out the shifts and the shift loadings and the value of, etc., etc. So we became much more prepared to allow the people themselves to do the allocation of individuals against crew role organisational accountabilities in the mine. Now, doing that in 1980 had all sorts of raised eyebrows, but they did it far more effectively than the traditional shift rostering clerk sitting separately from the people themselves. So the organisation made clear what expectations were about roles and capabilities, but the people themselves then allocated the individuals to each of the requirements. So that would be one example. The other is, I would say, Civil and Civic, who were a construction company. They were doing this kind of, their founder, G.J. Dusseldorp, was an interesting guy who was an immigrant, Dutch immigrant into Australia, and created one of our most successful construction companies. Their project company was Civil and Civic, and one of the principles he put in was that as a project person, senior project person, it was your responsibility to find enough projects who wanted your skills and talents, and if you couldn't find enough to be fully employed, then you knew you had to leave. Brutal, perhaps, but interesting. Probably one of the ones that I enjoyed most working with was changing the performance criteria for senior teams so that nobody could get their performance pay met without a minimum of 60% of their performance expectations required collaborative working with at least 3 other business units in the organisation. So we completely demolished individual performance pay as the primary reward system. And we managed to do that. I managed to do that in 3 or 4 organisations. So rather than just preaching collaboration, we changed the system, which meant that if you didn't collaborate and work collectively And if your colleagues didn't endorse the fact that you had been part of working collaboratively to achieve, then you couldn't get your money. Imagine if we did that. That we were actually serious about, that the system was coherent with the let's be collaborative. Of course, the classic person who took things to the ultimate around this was Ricardo Semler in the book Maverick. He believed Dunbar's figures of 5, 15 and 150, and he would, every time one of his companies got to 150, he'd spin off and create another company, because he believed that the notion that if you could only hold 150 separate identities, and he absolutely had, each company had its own HR department and finance department, and therefore were able to know each other and so on. And he famously said once, "I'm really pleased that I was rejected from attending Harvard, otherwise I would never have been able to be this creative and innovative." I'm not, his organisations still exist.
I think the other thing that I would add there is that the Cynefin framework is particularly helpful in my experience in this space around having conversations linked to constraints, around org design. And you know, so for example, in the organisation that I'm doing some work with here at the moment, there are some things that are written in the Constitution. And the way that they have been articulated in the Constitution, my read of it is that they have been silent around a range of things that I think can be enabling constraints through the Cynefin framework, but have actually been considered to be rigid or governing constraints. So, for example, the way that they currently provide their bonus payments, it's called a bonus payment, but actually it's calculated and everybody gets it according to a formula that's written in the Constitution. Now, I don't think it should be called a bonus if that's what it is, and it certainly shouldn't be linked to performance. So it's how do you then look at, through the lens of Cynefin, whether it is rigid, what sort of constraint is it, and therefore what might you do in that space? So the notion of enabling constraints and how we'll work with that around some key organisational artefacts is something that we're exploring at the moment.
And that reminds me, Julie, what we've also done in a number of areas in partnerships, so multiple organisations needing to work together, we've used the Cynefin framework to create the partnering agreement. What are the rigid constraints that we're all signing on to? So what are the absolute things that we will all agree to? Governing constraints, if you like, or the expert domain. Where will the experts get together to agree on? What's the areas for experimentation and so on? And how will we resolve conflict? And that's become a basic framework for creating partnering agreements, one of which exists between 4 very, very disparate organisations across 2 continents. And again, it's about constraints, but it becomes a very powerful way to say, yes, there are some things that are known and then we're going to sign on to, and that's simple, but there's also got to be places for emergence and so on and so forth. So that's designing in terms of a partnership and partnering arrangement, and that's a mixture of not-for-profit, faith, consulting groups coming together inside a complexity framework, and has been able to be put together relatively easily, I have to say, about how will we work together to create new IP, new products and resources.
Yeah. And the other thing we're looking at with this particular organisation too is their governance, how we can actually bring a range of perspectives in through subcommittees, for example, linked to board, and how we inform who will be on those subcommittees, because as I said before, this was they worked in a very small bubble, was quite closed. So we're opening it up through a range of mechanisms that are available in the way that the organisation has been structured and how the criteria for getting those on there. For example, they are able to have 2 non-executive directors on their board, and they never have. So with the way that the organisation is moving, we're suggesting that bringing people in who have perspectives, who provide broadening of perspective in areas that are going to be helpful for the organisation, is something that will now be activated, hadn't been before. So what can you work with? What do you need to bring in that is additional to that? And at what level are all things that we're thinking through. We ran a month-long campaign to get feedback from the staff around the strategic plan that had never been done before in the organisation. So we actually had it was quite structured around every week had a different theme, and then that was all collated and generated back to management and board in terms of feedback. So and as Viv said, we're also doing some work around roles and span of accountability in ways that haven't been done before, that are informed by complexity principles from our perspective, linked to that notion of constraints. So that's a really helpful lens through which to view things, in my experience.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump on something that you had said earlier, which made me very excited, is this idea of the governing and the enabling constraints, and in terms of the perception of those constraints, is something that is underappreciated, and I think is actually really core to this stuff. And the way that I've always phrased that is one person's enabling constraint is another person's governing constraint, and we don't raise that to the top of the stack in terms of what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and when I was appointed at one stage to I took a contract as head of employee relations for a big change process for a water authority, and I kept being told we're not allowed to do that, the unions won't let it, so they won't let it, so they won't let us, they won't let it. And the question I would always ask, well, prove it, where is it written? And the mythology that builds up about this fantastic these all-powerful they who won't allow something to happen, stopping to ask the question, really, where is it written? Show me the evidence. So it's back to this, what's actually happening, as opposed to some kind of, what extent is the constraint real, or has it been built up as some kind of mythology? One of the things, it was a very, I have been unkind and said it had been untouched by human hands or creative thought for about a century, this particular organisation. And one of the things that I learned to do was that, what if this happened and what if that happened? And so what I did was treat every one of their objections as if it was real and reasonable, and said, well, let's assume it did happen. What should we do to either prevent it, or what should we do if it does? And I ended up the first time with a document of 33 pages before they ran out of the most extraordinary fantasies of what ifs. It was, I wish I had kept the document. It would have made a fabulous fantasy novel, right? And finally, they ran out of anything that they could think of that could possibly maybe happen that would prevent them from trying to do something different. And then I registered it with the Industrial Tribunal as a legitimate document, at which I can remember Commissioner Varnum looking at me and saying, I just said, John, just take a deep breath and register it for me. Because by then they had run out of anything that they could, and they had to try. The second thing I learned, and this came from one of my very great mentors, who was the union official for the Waterside Workers Federation, Charlie Fitzgibbon, longshoreman in your language in the US. And he said to me, Viv, don't change the world all at once, mate. You do it one small step at a time. And he said, mate, let me give you the best lie you will ever tell. say to them, just try it once, and if it doesn't work, you can go back to the way they were. You see, because it never can. But lie with conviction, mate, lie with conviction. And it became known as the one-off, no prejudice. Just try it once without prejudice, and if it doesn't work, we can go back to the way it was. Because what Charlie knew was as soon as you got people to try just a little thing differently, it had shifted the perspective sufficiently that it could never go back to the way it was. And you could have a conversation about, well, that didn't work, what might? And he taught me that in 1972 on the Brisbane waterfront, and it's still true today. Shifting perspective is one of the most important and critical things in what we're doing. It's not changing mindsets, it's shifting perspectives. Getting people to see things just a little bit differently opens up the gate to a whole bunch of other possibilities and options. And so, yes, one off, no prejudice became one of the catch cries. Just try it once. And then it became a game because they certainly, they knew. I knew and they knew that I knew that this was the game, but that was okay. We became part of the process of doing it differently. So he knew way back in 1972 that the game in changing a complex system was a little bit at a time. Don't try and sell the whole big grand vision, a little bit at a time and a little bit at a time, and checking, and sooner or later we got container ships into the port of Brisbane. And
it's about conditions and connections, but connections in particular. You can't change people's minds. What you can do is provide different connections and different opportunities for them to experience. And then as a result of that, they will know stuff they didn't know before. They can make choices they didn't know they were going to make before. There's a whole lot of stuff that can come out of that, but you can't force it. You can create the space, create the opportunity, and people step into that.
Yeah, persistent adaptation or acceptation, creating that environment. Yep. Rather than persistently cramming things down people's throats. Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm just saying, Charlie Fitzgibbon was the Federated Waterside Workers Union president, a very good communist union official, much to the horror of my mother, who used to say, it's about the company you're keeping. But he was a very clever, natural complexity worker. Julie and I have another meeting in 8 minutes, so I'm not much.
I was just going to say, a constraint's part of the minimal viable theory.
Unfortunately, my internet cut out just as I was about to say thank you very much. So I'm back, and I think we've answered all of the questions that were in the chat and the various hands that were raised. Viv and Julie will be coming back for a second session sometime in the not too distant future. So please, all of you, come on back and visit with them again. Viv, Julie, we really want to thank you so much. This has been awesome. You guys brought it big time, and we can't thank you enough. And we will see you all soon.
Yep, and the videos will be posted up. Yep.
Thanks very much. And a couple of things we'll send through Jocko and Barbara to attach.
And they can find you all at complexability.com.au. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes. Our website's currently being refreshed. You'll see the old one. The new one is far more beautiful. That's coming in about a couple of weeks. And we'll keep you, and we'll send, if people are interested in joining the community of practice, we'll send the link. It's free.
Yeah, because that's free. There's lots of stuff in there.
A whole stack there. And the website is complexability.com.au.
Yep, it's in the description of the meetup. Yep.
See you again. See you, Michael. Gary.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.